So I am a Buddhist nun, and I've been a nun for 22 years, 24 years if you consider the time as a postulant. And what that means is that I'm a meditator and I teach meditation, and my life is built around the principles of simplicity, renunciation, generosity, service. And one of the ways that that manifests is that for the last 22 years, I have not handled money. So that means that everything that I have and the food that I eat is all given to me. And obviously, you know, I see people's jaws drop and their eyes open like, how on earth, you know, is this possible?
We would applaud if we could.
So in order, it would take a long time to go through all the details, so I wrote up a description of some of the mechanics of how it's possible to live as an alms mendicant. It's just outside on the bench if you want to have a look. So for 20 years, I lived in a community in England with between 35 and 55 other monks and nuns that was extremely well supported. And all of those things like food and requisites was part of the fabric of the monastery to take care of. And I'm living in a monastery of one, and I live right next to the Garden of the Gods in a little hermitage. And I was not born this way. So I was born into a middle-class Jewish family in Los Angeles. And one of the real blessings of my life is that I knew from the very beginning that I was completely loved by both my parents. So that's a gift that I carry with me. And in 1979, when I was 17 years old, I went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, and I walked into a class that was taught by Jack Engler, who well, he's part of he was part of the forerunners of the transpersonal psychology movement. And he was teaching a class on religions of India. And what he was talking about was the nature of suffering and how suffering is a truth that pervades all of life. And he was also talking about how when you really focus in on where the problem isn't found so much in the external circumstances, but the problem can be located in wanting and not wanting things to be the way they are. Mm-hmm. And then he said that when you focus precisely on that wanting and not wanting, when you are able to allow your mind to be with wanting and let it soften, then right exactly where the suffering arises, where the suffering ends. And then he talked about a path, a whole path that brings to the end of suffering. And I was sitting in that class and I felt like somebody had taken a match and threw it on a bonfire that was doused with kerosene. I was ignited. And in 1 week of being in that class, I was absolutely clear that somehow the spiritual life was going to be the center of my life. And after 1 month of being in that class, I had a vision of being a nun. Now, coming from a Jewish family, we don't have nuns. This is not something that we have or we do or we have any frame of reference for. And so if you were to say, you know, how is it possible that at 17 there is somebody who's giving their life to realize the end of suffering? Well, if you were in a traditional context, people would say she had tremendous virtue. This is all the result of past imprints of positive actions and determination. And if you were to look in a modern context, people would say she must have been really suffering. And I can say that both were true. Both were true. And so I had a strong aspiration. And so Jack was talking about different masters that he had met or he'd known about who'd taken these teachings and realized a tremendous amount of freedom from them. He mentioned Ajahn Chah, he mentioned Ajahn Sumedho, he mentioned Ajahn Buddhadasa, and he mentioned Dipama. Now, this whole lineup of teachers, and Dipama was the only woman And he told us about her because when he was doing his work on his PhD thesis, he was in India for many months, interviewing her specifically because her realization was so profound. He wanted to understand how it affected the way she experienced herself. So he had fabulous stories to tell. He talked about her life. He talked about how she, the kind of suffering that she experienced. She was, in a 10-year period of time, she lost 2 children. She lost her health. She lost her husband. She experienced betrayal from her in-laws. And she was in Burma, which was, far, far away from her motherland, raising her daughter, her 7-year-old daughter, by herself. And so the kind of desperation that she experienced was that, the doctors couldn't help her. There was nothing else in the world that was going to help her. And so she had the clarity that the only thing she thought that would be of any use was to meditate. And so what she did was she wholeheartedly went to a meditation retreat center and focused on the meditation. And in a remarkably short period of time, her mind opened up and she experienced the kind of radical freedom that meditation is designed to bring us towards. And so, like virtually overnight, she transformed from being somebody who was sick and miserable and dependent and desperate to being somebody who was radiant and luminous and confident, and many of her health problems had disappeared. So Jack was telling about her, her psychic powers, her attainments, all these stories about her. And I remember one story that he told that really captivated my attention. She was in the room, and Munindraji, who had been her teacher, was there, and he was talking with one of the male students, and the male student was asking how it was or why it was that only men could become Buddhas. Now, everyone thought Deepama was sleeping in the back of the room because she looked like she was falling asleep. Looked like there was no attention. She sat bolt upright and said with a very strong voice, "I can do anything that a man can do." And the whole group cracked up. I heard this, and I thought, I want to meet her. So in that class in 1979, I made this determination. I wanted to go on pilgrimage and I wanted to meet Deepama. I wanted to find out what it was actually like to be in the presence of a person like that. So, life happens. And one of the things that happened is that I graduated college and I worked as an analytical chemist, and then I had decided that I was going on this pilgrimage, both to meet Deepama and also to see about my aspiration to be a nun. And I reconnected with the man that I had been completely in love with when I was in high school. And a very loving and very nourishing relationship blossomed, and we lived together. And then I was like, oh my goodness, now what do I do? Because the love was a deep, mature love. And yet there was something in my heart that was like, there's something in my heart that's asking me to go forth with this, and I have no frame of reference that I have any way of understanding why. But he supported, and so I decided that I would still go on the pilgrimage. And so I left, and when I left, I bought a one-way ticket, and I quit my job, and I found a home for my cat, and I gave away all my belongings, and I said goodbye to my family and friends, and I headed to India. And I landed and eventually made my way to Bodh Gaya, which is the holiest place for Buddhists in the world. And I did a retreat there with a teacher who I had been doing retreats before. And then I made my way to Calcutta. And when I got to Calcutta, traveling through India is just unbelievable with the kind of confusion and the chaos and the sensory impact. And I remember walking up the steps in the Mahabodhi Society and into this room that was about the size of this room with a platform and monks chanting on one end of the platform, and there were a bunch of cushions on the floor. And in front of me, about 6 feet in front of me, was this tiny little woman swathed in a white sari. And as I was adjusting to the quiet, I was feeling this tremendous power that was almost pushing me back. And I thought, who on earth is that? Well, I had met Deepama. So David and Matthew and I, we all stayed at the Mahabodhi Society, and we walked across the streets in Calcutta to her tiny little place where she lived with her daughter, Deepa, and her grandson, Rishi. And we would sit with her, we would meditate with her, we would ask her questions, and Deepa would translate. And when we would leave, she would put her hands on our heads, these tiny little hands, and she would blow, and she would chant, and there would be like this waterfall of love that was completely cascading through our system. Being in her presence was like being in a vast, huge, silent ocean of love. And I remember riding home to my family and my friends, and I remember saying, if my journey ends at this point, it would have been enough to just meet a person like that and to have direct experience of what that feels like. It was incredible. Now, I had this 1970s feminist idea about what power was, where a woman would grab a chainsaw, jump in the back of a pickup truck, and off she'd go. And here I was in this presence of this tiny little person, and her power was her power of presence and her power of love. It was incredible. So this energized my aspiration to give my life to the ending of suffering, to use my life to realize these truths. And my pilgrimage in India continued, and I had some other remarkable experiences, including a near-death experience with a bear, which is a whole other story. And that also captivated my attention about, wow, life can be gone in an instant. And so when I was in Thailand, I decided that I wanted to ordain. So I went back home to my family and friends, and I said hello and goodbye, and I went to England, where the monastery was. The year that I went to England in 1989 was the year that Deepama died. And so I wanted to create a living memorial for her. So I planted a tree in the back field of Amaravati in the Buddha Grove. It was a little oak tree, and when we first planted it, it was just like a stick in the ground, and there were only 2 sisters that came and helped me plant the tree. And I would take her photo, and I would prop it in the tiny little branches, and I would chant, and I would do walking meditation around it. And, the first years in the monastery were challenging. There was a lot of adjustment. It was quite a shift from the life that I had led. And every time things were difficult, I would go out to that tree, and I would feel a lot of peace, a lot of calm. So there was a time when I left England and I was traveling around the world. So as an alms mendicant, I live on the generosity of others. And even though this is the case, it is also the case that I have been able to travel a lot. So I was traveling and had been a while. And then when I came back to the monastery, I could not remember where the tree was, because it had grown a lot and I couldn't recognize it by the shape. So I went to all of the trees that were in the area, and I pressed my back against each of them, and most of the trees felt like a tree. It has a bark, and it hurts, and it pushes, and it has resistance. But when I got to one tree where I felt like I was standing under a waterfall of love, I knew I had found Deepama's tree. Now, because I love nature, and because I love Deepama, and because I love the tree, I wanted to mark it. So I have family here. My brother, my sister-in-law are here, my father was here, and I traveled to Colorado regularly. So once I was on a camping trip, and I brought back a huge stone, and I took it in my backpack back to give it to the tree. And I also had a stone that was from the tile of the Amaravati temple that was at the base of the tree. And that was just a way of marking it. So once I was having a meal with Kathy and Tony Halter, and Kathy was talking about this mother tree that was in the back field of Amaravati in the Buddha Grove, and I asked her, well, where exactly is that tree? And she had found it and named it by its loving energy without knowing about Deepama, my connection with her, or her qualities. It was just incredible. So another whole huge story is what it's actually like being a modern person living in a traditional context in an ancient form. And the story of the nuns is a book. It's not another 15 minutes. It's a whole long book. And so what happened is, as the sisters got more confident about the extraordinary situation that we were in, where we were feeling blessed with the opportunity to live this life and be supported in this way, but navigating the challenges of a traditional form, then what happened is that as we got more confident and more coherent, the monks started getting more agitated. And so this agitation started to bubble and percolate until it became like a crescendo. And so I was scheduled for a very significant meeting with the senior monk and some of the other sisters. And before I went to this meeting, I went to Deepama's tree. And I stood on that tile stone and pressed my back against the tree, and I felt that waterfall of love, and I walked into that meeting. And that meeting was a very difficult meeting. And when I came out of that meeting, I went back to Deepama's tree, and that flat tile stone that had been intact just before the meeting was cracked. And I saw the crack, and I knew that it was done, that something had shifted. I could no longer be in that community. I could no longer be part of that situation. So I decided, after being part of that community for 20 years, that I would leave. As an alms mendicant, with no support, with no funds, with no invitation, with no place to go, I said I was going to come back to the States. And so coming back here was a huge transition. Now, one of the things that I love about Colorado Springs is the Garden of the Gods. I love those rocks. And I love them not just because they are beautiful, but because for me it's like sitting at the feet of the Master. They are a porthole to pure presence. They hold me and allow me to feel whatever it is that I'm feeling until I completely let it go. And one of the things that I have learned is that with the feelings that I've had, with the fear, with the anger, with the dislocation, with the anxiety, with the uncertainty, with the incredible longing, that I can hold it, that everything is welcome, and that when I let go, what is left is love. And this love is not something that is just a state. It's something that pervades everything. It pervades everyone. It pervades time and space. So what I'd like to ask, rather than clap, is to just let your own mind follow the images and the sensations, the stories. Watch them change, watch them fade. And as they fade, let your attention rest in the space that they have faded into. Thank you.